Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Reese. I'm an assistant professor in the City and Regional Planning Program. And the following video talks about another aspect of discrimination in the context of zoning, and that is expulsive zoning. So if you can just bear with me 1 second while I open up my slides for this short mini lecture. So in our discussion around Euclid and its aftermath, we talked briefly about the role of zoning in the context of excluding via more exclusionary zoning techniques. These could include things such as restrictions on multifamily or a variety of limitations to development that prohibit most things except for single-family detached housing. Expulsive zoning is a different phenomena, but also a phenomena which can be very detrimental in the context of communities' safety and health, the long-term sustainability of the community, and a technique which was often racially motivated and certainly had very clear disparate racial outcomes in terms of which neighborhoods were most penalized by expulsive zoning practices. I'm going to start with some common definitions, and this pulls from the Segregation by Design book, excellent book to read on this topic and a number of other aspects of thinking about the influence of planning and zoning on different forms of residential segregation. But Traunstein defines expulsive zoning as the practice of citing industrial, semi-industrial, or other nuisances in neighborhoods of color to both preserve white neighborhoods and to induce Black movement into particular parts of the city. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit with a quote from article Law Review actually put together by Poe, Neighborhood Upzoning and Racial Displacement, where Poe kind of lines out a hypothetical as to how expulsive zoning practices could create kind of clear disparities in terms of both upzonings, but also the intensification of manufacturing or more kind of environmentally challenging land uses, particularly in communities of color. And so just to paraphrase real quick here in terms of Poe's kind of hypothetical, it says, imagine, for example, a completely residential municipality split between a low-income minority and upper-income white neighborhood, so an existing residentially segregated area, which could come about via practices of racial zoning, the use of restrictive covenants, or just other aspects of exclusionary zoning in the context of housing and development policy. And so as Poe kind of continues with this hypothetical, noting that years after incorporation, the city decides that in an effort to diversify its tax base, it will allocate some of its land for industrial use. However, the city has put this new industrial land somewhere, and the white residents soon mobilize to ensure this new zoning designation does not encroach upon their neighborhood. Left with little alternative, the city chooses to rezone parts of the minority neighborhood for industrial use, allowing a bevy of highly pollutant companies to set up shop in the once exclusively residential area. Gradually, the new minority neighborhood spirals into a state of neglect as residents uncomfortable with the new nuisance leave for somewhere more palatable. So here we see Poe kind of lays out a real I think very easy to understand hypothetical in terms of how expulsive zoning practices in the end kind of result in upzoning of predominantly marginalized communities of color. And then, of course, the growing intensity of environmentally unfriendly and unhealthy land uses within those spaces. Now, in this particular dynamic, Poe kind of emphasizes the role of political capital in terms of determining where or where not to cite industrial land uses. In the city, in this context, again, is trying to expand its tax base, and is bowing to this political pressure in terms of where it decides to rezone. In reality, the history is much more complicated, and there's much more intentionality in the context of the behavior of cities in terms of expulsive zoning practices. And for a quick example of this, we'll take a look at Austin, Texas. Austin has long been a very kind of important case study of expulsive zoning practices, in many ways stemming from the 1928 city plan for Austin, which did several things that kind of set forth a trajectory of future land use decisions in the city of Austin that we can still see ramifications from today. In short, the 1928 plan designates East Austin for the Black population, and then rezones a large area within East Austin to industrial use. Now, in combination with this designation as being the district for the Black population in East Austin, there was some attempt to align some social services and things of that nature into the East Austin area. But I think the more lasting impact was the upzoning of this area, which would again continue in terms of future rezoning in the 1950s, where an even larger area within East Austin would be upzoned to allow more industrial use. In addition to this dynamic, we would see then the western side of Austin, a great degree of kind of what I would call beneficial infrastructure gets allocated, right? Better, for example, better parks, more kind of basic infrastructure such as water and sewer, road quality, et cetera, et cetera. And so very quickly begin to see kind of two different zones in Austin in terms from an area that is heavily exclusionary, for example, in the context of West Austin, but also receiving a lot of the infrastructure that we know is beneficial to growing residential areas, or even to just sustaining residential areas. In contrast, if we look at East Austin, we see a neighborhood that is to some degree already beginning to be racially segregated. The city emphasizes that pattern of segregation more with the 1920 plan, and then makes these land use changes, which in the end results in more toxic and industrial uses going into the East Austin area. And therefore, we get to see kind of two different trajectories for different neighborhoods where communities, and in particular marginalized communities of color, see a heavy concentration of industrial uses, which then become incredibly problematic from the perspective of the sustainability of the neighborhood, but in particular the health and safety of residents within that community. Now, I want to kind of reflect quickly on a little planning law as well, or legal history in the context of planning, and how that relates to this context of expulsive zoning. As any of you who have taken planning law, you'll remember one of the classic cases that we read on nuisance, Bub v. Donner Hannah Koch, which is from the state court in New York in 1932. And in this particular case, for those who haven't read it, just to summarize it very quickly, Bub is a property owner who owns a business and some rental properties and also lives at the property, and sues the Hannah Koch company because of the pollution, health impacts, and economic impacts of a coke smelting operation that was built right across the street from her. Although Bub predated Hannah Koch coming into this area, the court in this case decided that nuisance doctrine does not apply when someone moves into an existing and known industrial area. So even though the Koch company moved in after Bub did, the court in this context said, well, this area already had some industry located in it, had infrastructure for industry, therefore you came into a known industrial area. And in this scenario, the doctrine that comes out of this is the doctrine known as coming to the nuisance. And so in this case, you are unable to seek judicial relief from a nuisance claim, particularly from the perspective of pollution concerns or health impacts, if someone was to move into an area that already had existing industrial uses. Now you have to also kind of think in this context in the 1930s, we did not have any of the protections of, say, kind of our more contemporary environmental justice statutes or policies. And so this kind of nuisance relief was really the only form of relief you could seek in this context. So why this is important from a zoning perspective is that in the context of manufacturing zoning, once an area is zoned manufacturing, that really sets the course for residents within those areas not having any nuisance relief from industrial uses, especially during this time period of the 1930s and 40s and onward. Coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, the current zip code where the Bob V. Hanna Coke operation existed currently has one of the highest rates or one of the higher rates of cancer incidence in New York State. In many ways, probably a byproduct of the long legacy of industry in that particular community or neighborhood. And so again, as we think about expulsive zoning practices, the real harm produced in this context is the health and environmental impacts of manufacturing uses and industrial uses, which get predominantly targeted to marginalized communities of color. To wrap up this, I want to provide some empirical evidence looking into expulsive zoning. And this slide summarizes some of the findings from Professor Whitmore's 2017 paper looking at race and class bias in zoning and rezonings involving heavy commercial industrial land use in Durham, North Carolina. And the key finding I want to focus on here is particularly during this this time period of 1945 to 1984, Professor Whitmore finds that downzonings, where intensity of use was decreased, was more likely to occur in areas with statistically a larger white population, and that upzonings were more likely to occur in areas that were predominantly African American. And so race was a very significant factor in this context if you look at this pattern of industrial siting in Durham during this time period. Now, Professor Whitmore also notes that the later period of zoning decisions would be influenced by the growing and emerging environmental justice movement. So we see this pattern not hold up as extensively after 1985. But just providing some empirical context of how expulsive zoning practices can be racially discriminatory in the context of creating significant health risks, as well as kind of undermining the quality of life and the sustainability of particular neighborhoods that were targeted for upzoning or more industrial and manufacturing use. So a few reflection questions for you as you think about expulsive zoning. The first being, what are the mechanisms of expulsive zoning? How does expulsive zoning work in the context of how is it that areas get rezoned in a way that more industrial sightings occur within these particular communities? And how does expulsive zoning kind of impact quality of life in neighborhoods? What are some of the direct impacts that we could see from this in terms of expulsive zoning practices? And thank you for your time. And again, feel free to reach out at any point if you have any questions about this lecture. And thank you very much.